Steve, thanks for catching up, mate. I really appreciate it in these sort of weird times. Um, I usually sort of, whenever I see you, harass you over what's going on with Brexit and what you think is going to happen to the UK, but that kind of seems like very minor sort of concerns, and wish we were right back there now. But,
I don't think you're an island in that respect. I think a lot of people in the UK would be wishing for those problems back again compared to what they've got now.
Yeah, and they still got it to come as well. It's I was hoping we could catch up. We've been doing these busy insights, and one of the things that happens with these, incredible times like this is that we all suddenly become experts. It's like when you watch the Summer Olympics, and all of a sudden I'm an expert on the javelin and how to throw it. And all of a sudden we're all experts on the economy, on quarantine, and self-isolation, all that sort of thing. And one of those things that consistently comes up in our world is the impact of international trade on tradies, employers, and then the fact that then that hits apprentices. And I figured, the best thing to do is speak to yourself because, former Minister for Trade, Tourism, Investment, International Trade. I really was hoping, we could maybe get a perspective from yourself as to how this whole coronavirus impacts international trade and then how it impacts jobs here in Australia.
Yes, sure. Happy to, Paul. And look, thanks for reaching out. And the world, as we know, has continued to go down the path of being more and more integrated and more globalized. And that works in two ways. On the plus side, the advantage is that it means that you can have supply chains, low-cost manufacturing bases. And as we all know, most things these days are stamped with made in China on them. And that worked very well for quite a period of time. But of course, the downside to that is that when you have something like this novel coronavirus, then you end up with a new situation, which means the rapid dispersal of this virus, which of course is impacting everybody in exactly the way that we're seeing take place now. So that's giving rise to a number of different forces. I think it's still very early days, and I can't stress that enough. So we've got to see exactly how this plays out. And there's what I'd call micro and macro forces at play. On the one hand, you look at the big macro environment, what's going to happen between the United States and China. We know that President Trump is never afraid to take a forward-leaning approach in terms of engaging with China. Exactly. So we've got to just see how that plays out, especially in an election year, because bear in mind, President Trump is up for re-election again in November of this year. So that's what I'd call sort of the big macro, the big picture events. Then you've got the micro events, and that is, how does what's happening actually affect me? Now, a lot of people would say, well, most people don't think they're going to be affected, but I actually disagree with that. If you recall, in the very early weeks when this all started, and we saw so-called panic shopping, when people were buying, remember, toilet paper and pasta and all those things. Why were they buying that? I think instinctively, people knew and had witnessed with what took place in China, that if you did get a shutdown, and if you had high levels of people getting sick with this coronavirus, then that was going to impact on supply chains. And they thought, well, you know what? I might not be able to get toilet paper. I might not be able to get pasta. I might not be able to get these things. So I think there is actually a very broad, deep understanding in the community to say, we know, but they might not know the details of supply chains, but they understand broadly how supply chains work. And so that's why you saw that sudden rush of people racing out and buying things. They thought, this may not be available in 3 months. If it is, great. But if it's not, I want to make sure I've got it. And for those that are involved in trades, we've still got a lot of construction that's taking place now from a carryover from only what was now 2 or 3 months ago, but almost seems like a lifetime ago. People bullish on the property market then, and so you've got a lot of construction projects, but all of a sudden they're having trouble getting certain building supplies, for example, because those things are manufactured in China. Those white goods are manufactured in China. Those, whatever it might have been, renders all sorts of different things which may have been made in China. Now they either were not producing them in China, or they're having trouble seeing it dispersed in Australia. And so you're getting some of these kinks in the supply chain, which of course sometimes means that people aren't able to maintain sort of being engaged and involved in their work.
Yeah. So obviously that's had a major impact on small employers, well, all employers, but employers and tradies, and then the uptake of apprentices.
Yes.
With what's now going on in Wuhan, and you know China well, you've been to China many times, and with what's going on in Wuhan now, will we start to see things improve? And if so, realistically, how long does that take to improve for Australia in terms of that whole supply chain management?
Look, I think it's really hard to predict where it goes from here. We've had great success in Australia. I mean, look, every death is a tragic death. We've had as of the time that you and I are having this conversation, a little over 60 deaths and just over 6,400 people that have been infected with this coronavirus. Hopefully, we continue to see containment of it. And keeping it contained, especially in a country like Australia, where we have, thankfully, borders, our land is girt by sea, we've got sea borders, and so we're able to close down. I mean, if we continue to track with relatively low levels of infection, low levels of community spread, community transmission, and we actually see the numbers really taper off, well, then I could realistically say, well, I think Australia could open up domestically again. We could start to see the free movement of people in a very staggered and strategic way, but enable the domestic economy to keep will start going again. Look, I think we're going to have restrictions on international travel for quite some time. It can almost be guaranteed through to the end of the year. Anybody who comes, any Australian or anybody else who travels into Australia internationally would have to go through, I expect, quarantine for 14 days, unless we've got some new type of rapid test that we're able to use. So in that situation, that would actually be a good outcome where we were able to open up domestically, although still continue to have prohibitions or quarantine periods on international travel. That at least would give a bit of oomph behind the domestic economy and get things up and going again, especially those involved in hospitality, those involved in a range of different areas where they need people to be out and about.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the really key positives, of course, is what's happened in Australia. As long with New Zealand, we seem to really differentiate ourselves from the rest of the world and how we manage this, albeit, we do have things like our size and our population in our advantage, but we seem to have managed it really well. But you were one of the people that, you saw this very early on because of your background, because of your knowledge of China, international trade, you saw this very early on, you saw what was coming. Do you have a view, the IMF overnight sort of said, this is going to be the worst recession depression since 1929. Do you have a view or any hope that potentially there's a way of avoiding that in Australia?
No, there's no way to avoid it. All we can do now is try to make it as short and sharp a correction, for lack of a better term, or a recession as possible. I mean, that's probably the objective here. And again, the government, I think, has done a really good job at getting that wage keeper subsidy out, putting a lot of emphasis on training, which they will, of course, on the apprenticeships, because they want to make sure that people are using this time effectively. They want to prime the economy by providing cash stimulus to make sure that workers are in a position to be able to hit the ground running, maintain their mortgages or pay their rent or any of those types of things that they need to do. Because if you don't keep those payments up, then you run the risk of a much more protracted, deeper, longer-lasting economic downturn, and that's no good for anybody. So, we've learned a few tricks along the way, and certainly the big stimulus that we've seen, Australia's stimulus as a percent of GDP is something like 16% or just over 16%. It's a big package. A lot of focus and emphasis on making sure employers keep employees. It's still going to require a lot of adjustment. We're all getting used to working from home. We're all getting used to, what we need to do. And I've seen calls for Australia to start, bringing back on shore a lot of our supply chain, what we call domestic sovereignty, to make sure that we don't need to reach abroad. Now, that can be a double-edged sword. A lot of people go, oh, that's great, we need that. Yes, we do. But bear in mind that if every country in the world does that, Australia traditionally has been a big exporting nation. We export much more than we import. And in that situation, if you have an inward-looking approach all around the world, then that's actually not going to do much to improve.
I really wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask you this point because it's something in my mind a lot that there's going to be a whole range of social and economic changes in the way we behave as an international community coming out of this situation. And one of those that worries me is this movement against free trade.
Sure.
To what extent does it worry? To what extent do you think we'll go down that path?
Look, it's like everything. I don't think you want to necessarily be idealistic about it, but you do want to be practical about it. Free trade at any cost clearly is not in step with, I think, where most people are these days. People are looking for knowledge, certainty, comfort, security, from thinking, we can produce these essential things that we need, things like medicines, for example, things like hospital equipment, but also more broadly than that, other key, economic attributes that we need. And they want to see that made on shore. We need to focus on that. But we also, Paul, can't lose sight of the fact that historically, Australia has had a very high cost, labour intensive cost base.
Yeah.
And that's been one of the reasons why a lot of things went offshore. Now, as we see more automation move into the economy, that becomes less of a feature. But what it really does reinforce is the need that people must reinvest or must invest in themselves and their human capital. They've got to invest in training. They've got to invest in education. You can't say, well, I finished my formal education when I left grade 10 or grade 12 or something. I'm never going back to do anything further. If you do that, you really run the risk of not being prepared for what the future holds. And, it's really important that people recognise that in a much more digital world, we need to be aware of that. I mean, there's cross forces here. You've got consumers who I think are going to emerge from this period of being, contained and quarantined in their homes, I think with more appetite for online marketplaces, for online shops, for online shopping than they've ever had before. This will be the trigger that for many people will see them make their very first purchases online.
Yeah.
And I think once they start doing that, they'll probably like it. So consumers are shifting actually in a bizarre way away from bricks and mortar and more towards digital. But parallel with that, we've got governments and populations generally saying, oh, we don't like this globalization stuff. We want to see more investment in onshoring and domestic production. And so those two things almost seem to run counterintuitive to each other. But this is going to be what we need to balance up.
Yeah, it's funny. I think even within Busy, the movement to delivering online, it's one of those things that as companies are all doing in 2 or 3 weeks what we previously planned on doing in the next 2 or 3 years. And certainly coming back to your point about training, the government's had a big push this week on online training. So for me, this period is very much an opportunity to invest in yourself, invest in what those skills will be as we come out of this, which will be in a lot of those sort of managing online platforms and transport logistics and all those sort of areas. I suppose just to wrap up, maybe there's a couple of things I want to ask you. What are going to be the green shoots for you that you'll be looking to see that demonstrates that 6 months, a year, 12 months, 18 months that we're actually getting through this? What will you be hoping for that demonstrates that we're on a path back to normality?
Well, I think that the seed of normality really lies in a vaccine or an effective therapeutic. That is, obviously, drugs that can be taken to prevent people from dying, or a vaccine. Now, we've seen incredible global collaboration on the development of a vaccine, and if we're successful with that, then you can expect the world will return to so-called normalcy relatively quickly. But what will normalcy be? Well, it'll be a new normal. I think, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying everything gets thrown out, but I suspect people will probably travel a little bit less. I suspect people will be a little bit more comfortable with preparing meals at home and doing those types of things, which is a subtle walking back from where we've been over the past 5 or 10 years. Plus, let's not lose sight of the fact that there's going to be a heavy human toll in all of this. There is going to be economic dislocation. There are going to be a lot of people unemployed. There are going to be a lot of people struggling to make ends meet. And governments can fill the void to a certain extent, but it's still going to come down to people needing to be mindful that their fellow community members, a lot of them going through really tough times. And so being able to engage in training, being able to engage in apprenticeships, being able to engage in the type of work that people can partake in to equip themselves with the skills and knowledge that they need, that's going to be critical for them finding a new place for themselves in the future, because there's going to be a lot of people, if they're unskilled, that will be competing for those unskilled jobs as things like waiters, waitresses, those types of unskilled work. And I think people will need to recognise they need to add value, and they get that through training. Yeah,
that's been the key message within Busy, is that there's going to be so many people to help over the next few years, and it's up to us to really sort of live our purpose. And I think back as well to John Howard in the late 90s, to David Cameron, in the GFC. For me, apprenticeships are such a great pathway for out of this, for youth unemployment, and in those skills areas that we actually going to need people in as well. So I'm kind of hopeful that that's where we start to invest some of those dollars, as we do start to look to come out of this. Mate, I was going to wrap it up. I've sort of been asking in these things for any quarantine hacks. So, I'm at home with an 8-year-old. I know you've got kids at home. She's driving me insane. Anything you've learned about yourself or the kids, or how to stay sane in the last sort of couple of weeks?
For me, I'm someone who's always wanted to do more exercise than I did. And basically, I think I was just a lazy bastard. And,
I've seen you coming out of the gym, actually. I have seen you come out of the gym. Yeah, so back in it.
now, for me now, Paul, it's been an opportunity actually to spend a little bit more time concentrating on myself and doing some exercise in the mornings and stuff. And it's made a big difference to me. I'm still too lazy and too fat, but I'm getting better. And it's incremental improvement.
Well, as quarantine goes on, you'll get there.
Hopefully.
Mate, thank you so much for catching up there. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise on this, and hopefully it's not as long as we all expect, and hopefully unemployment can stay lower. But it is what it is, and that's the reality. Hey.
Yeah, indeed. All the best to you, Paul. Good to speak with you.
Thanks, mate. Take care.
Cheers.